Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kyla Hannington, and I'm with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights. It is my pleasure to welcome you today for another in our Findley and Chris Talk Truth series. This series has been going on for about a year and a half since we did an anniversary celebration with the library system to celebrate the ADA in July of last year. And we were very fortunate because the Office of Human Rights had a connection to Findley and the library system had a connection to Chris. And they were such wonderful hosts for our anniversary event that we asked them if they would continue with us. And from that, the series Findley and Chris Talk Truth was born, the disability themed series where they talk about a wide range of things. We've talked about disability in academia. We've talked about ASL. We've talked about accessibility. And it's been very special. And I will say for everyone watching that tonight is actually the last one in this particular series because other commitments have come up. And I want to take a moment, even before we get going, to just thank both Chris and Findley for what you've brought to our offices and to Prince George's County. Like I can say truthfully, as someone who's been here watching, I've learned so much and see ways that I can improve my personal and my professional life from what you've offered. So thank you both so much for your time. Tonight is also special because not only are we partnering with the library system for this one, but this is also in partnership with Joe's Movement Emporium and the Prince George's County Community College Center for Performing Arts. Because today, Chris and Findley are going to look in depth at the book Sitting Pretty. And this is a book from a disability advocate and creator. And it's a beautiful, nuanced portrait of a body that looks and moves differently than most. Growing up as a paralyzed girl during the 90s and early 2000s, Rebecca Towson only saw disability depicted as something monstrous, such as the Hunchback of Notre Dame, or inspirational, like Helen Keller, or angelic, Forrest Gump. None of this felt right. And as she got older, she longed for more stories that allowed disability to be complex and ordinary, uncomfortable and fine, painful and fulfilling. Writing about the rhythms and textures of what it means to live in a body that doesn't fit, Rebecca reflects on everything from the complications of kindness and charity, living both independently and dependently, experiencing intimacy, and how the pervasiveness of ableism in our everyday media directly translates to everyday life. Disability affects all of us, directly or indirectly, at one point or another. By exploring this truth in poignant and lyrical essays, Taussig illustrates the needs for more stories and more voices to understand the diversity of humanity. So Sitting Pretty challenges us as a society to be patient and vigilant, practical and imaginative, kind and relentless as we set to work to write an entirely different story. So I'm very excited to hear what Findley and Chris have to say about this. And just before they get going, I'm going to tell you exactly who they are in case this is your first time tuning in. Findley Holland is a young disability activist and writer. She was diagnosed with autism and coexisting specific learning disabilities, dyscalculia and dysgraphia, when she was 7 years old. A later than average talker, Findley was also functionally illiterate into the 5th grade when she found the world of books on CD and her avid reading career began. In the autumn of 2019, Findley developed severe joint pain and has been diagnosed with a connective tissue disorder. She was appointed to Greenbelt's Youth Advisory Committee in 2016, where she worked on such initiatives as successfully lowering the voting age to 16 and raising awareness about human trafficking among youth. And as a young person with multiple disabilities, Findley welcomes the opportunity to speak to her experience and to educate members of the public about living with disabilities. In 2021, Findley started at Towson University, where she is the disability representative for the Student Government Association. And Christopher Newhouse is an experienced special education expert who serves as manager of curriculum, intervention, and assessment innovation for DC Public Schools. He previously worked as a special education teacher at Ludlow Taylor Elementary in Washington, DC for 5 years. And he also held positions at KIPP DC and Bridges Public Charter School. He began his teaching career in DC as a special education capital teaching resident. He holds a postmaster's certificate in educational learning, leadership and administration from George Washington University, a master's in special education and learning disabilities from American University, as well as a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Franklin and Marshall College. I actually think, Chris, you might even have an update to your bio than what I've just said, but I do want to say now, welcome both of you. It's just delightful to have you with us again.
Oh, thank you. You got it all, Kyla. Well, good evening, Findley. It's been a while, I guess, but since the summer. So
Yeah, no, wonderful to see you and wonderful to be back here again.
yes, likewise. I'm excited to talk about Sitting Pretty.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. I read it in like 6 hours when I read it. I just completely binged it. It was a very good book to read.
Yeah, it's definitely, her voice is so just authentic and reassuring, and every time I listen to it through audiobook, and I just felt myself drawn to the book just constantly. It's a really interesting and great read. I think that it's one I highly recommend to people I talk with now, and not in my field in special ed, because I was like, I, she talks about very much the intersectionality of issues that I've been talking about for a really long time. So I think that she's just a wonderful voice to have, and
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, no, I concur. And I have my notes on my phone, which is why I'm looking down. But one thing I kind of liked is so often I feel like you can read or listen to stories about disability, and sometimes what you can hear, you can tell that the author is very angry, and which isn't inherently a bad thing. But this author, she wasn't angry, was very like educational when she was talking about maybe these bad experiences she had, instead of being upset with the individual who in this bad experience, but rather more of a, this is an opportunity I can educate and just show an example of society. And it felt very open-hearted, which is something I liked reading, because so often, like I said, literature about disability, understandably, but can be negative, and unhappy. But I did really like seeing this literature that was in this very like open-hearted kind way.
Yeah, she kind of opened up in this book more of a dialogue rather than saying, well, we should be doing this, and that. And I think that for her to open a dialogue, for to share her experiences as well as the experiences of others, I think it was really eye-opening to me in the way that she talked about her disability and how she approached, you know, comments that could be very derogatory towards her, but she comes up with it with such an open heart, like you said, and I think that she has a way of talking about the systems that prohibit her from accessing, whether it's at the grocery store that she can't reach the items that she needs within that setting, or as simple as people perceiving her a certain way. I think that she's such a refreshing voice in disability community, and it reminded me a lot of Disability Visibility, but I loved how this book was kind of similar to her experience, as Disability Visibility is really good. It's a lot of different voices in one book, and I think that this was one that I think kind of lent to her having an open conversation with, which was nice.
Yeah. No, I haven't read Disability Visibility yet. I'm very sad by that. I really need to. But with this, one thing I liked, and when you're talking about the grocery store, reminded me of this later in the book, and I think maybe the last chapter, she talks about how often if there's something inaccessible at a store, like for example, people having like a fashion show in the accessible changing room. When she talks to the person who owns the store, the manager, it's very much like, oh yeah, call us when you come in and we'll make it accessible then. And instead of this, rather, let's make it accessible in general. Like when it happened with the inaccessible stall, with the accessible stall always being used, the manager's solution was, well, let me know when you're here and I'll close off the stall. Instead, which is kind of something like that, which is like though that's an option, another option is to make more accessible stalls, or to maybe put a sign on the door. Like there are these options that can help everyone, not just her, and bringing that to attention, because I think there is often when the solution for something that comes up is this, yes, I'll make it accessible for you, such as our accessible door is always locked, so if you call us, we'll unlock it for you, rather than having it pre-accessible, kind of using that universal design of having it always open.
And it opens up that conversation too, of that puts the responsibility on the person with the disability. I think, we have to, as a society, kind of think more broadly of how can we make our spaces more accessible, but not just accessible for a certain moment in time, but accessible for the elongated period of time that anyone with a specific type of disability or just a general disability that is similar to Rebecca's could need support, such as an adapted stall or a way to reach items in the grocery store that she could not readily reach on her own.
Yeah, no, it's very much that idea of universal design, which for those who might not know, it's essentially the idea that instead of having the things be accommodative and inaccessible things being right next door, kind of having them always together. So like one example I like to use is instead of having one accessible stall and 9 inaccessible stalls, do just 5 all accessible stalls. And I think that's one thing that she kind of talks about. And I very much am a fan of universal design, but it's also one thing she talks about, which I do kind of agree, which is how having the world accessible for her is great and her house is accessible for her, which is fine, but society should be universal. Anyone can use it at any time, no matter what.
Yeah, in my own work, we use universal design for learning. Very, very, very similar, same concept, and I'm a huge fan of it because it's one of those concepts that allow just any teacher to ensure that their classroom is accommodating all students, regardless of their disability. And I think that a lot of the time in the education field, at least, when we talk about universal design, it's, there's this mindset of, oh, I'm not certified in special education, or I can't support these students because I don't have this knowledge base. And I always say, well, there are ways that we can create accessible environments. And it starts with being mindful and thoughtful about the ways we construct those environments. And one tool I use in my box is universal design. And I think when we talk through the lens of ADA as well, I can talk through IDEA. And for those who don't know what IDEA is, it's the Individual for Disabilities Education Act. Was passed, oh my goodness, like the early 2000s. It was pretty recent when you talk about disability legislation in education, but it's one of those shifts where in education, there's a lot of talk about universal design in terms of meeting the learning needs of students. But then we talk about accessible spaces in ADA, and I mean, it's just, I feel like ADA is one of those legislative policies that has not truly evolved fully. And there are some spaces that are very respectful of people's disabilities. And some spaces like Rebecca was referring to, that she has to make the accommodation for herself by asking for these accommodations to be met in where she's going, instead of that institution thinking thoughtfully about how to support all people that within the store that could need those kind of supports, and expanding, like you said, the stalls that could be more accessible for her.
No, yeah, I think that's like a very good point. Like one thing, which is I know this is something I've talked about before with people, which is if there's a snowstorm and you only have time to shovel the stairs or the ramp, shovel the ramp, because everyone can use a ramp, when at least some people can use the stairs. And I think that's kind of like what we were talking about with education. That's very true. Like with subtitles, everyone, you can have subtitles on the screen. They can either read them or ignore them. But there are certain people. Sorry, the automatic lights in the room I'm in just kicked in. Yeah, like everyone, but only some people can only watch a video or something if there are subtitles attached. And I know that that's something I believe it was here. I've been doing a lot of disability reading for work recently, but I believe later in the end of this book, she mentions that there was an attempt to update the ADA in like 2017, but it was struck down. And so when you mentioned that made me think of it, which is, I think it's also interesting. There's so much disability related legislation besides the ADA or IDEA, and those are the most popular, well-known ones that we talk about. And with that, it is very complicated, which I definitely think there are some times where you might look at the ADA if you don't know a lot about disability in law and think that that's kind of the ideal, and being like, oh, we're following the ADA, like we have our one elevator. That's good, that's perfect, when in reality it's important to go above the ADA or above just what like the IDEA Act requires and go and make it better.
Because the ADA is the bare minimum. It's
Yes.
one of the legislative policies that I always, I'm working with schools in a different capacity now than I've worked with them before. And, we're always talking about creating more accessible tools for kids that, may need a more supportive ramp at the school for their wheelchair, or a Hoya lift for changing in the classroom, or certain supports of that nature. And it's always with the mindset of, the district, it's a super imperative that schools are outfitted with all of these building tools and systems that they can enhance their ability to be more accessible. But it's always such a fight. It really is. It's always about funding, and the ADA, it's definitely not, I would say, a gold star. It's a place to start, and I think that it's always important to provide that mindset. Even IDEA is super similar. I'm always like, that is the bare minimum, and that is what's legally required.
Yeah. No, that's one thing I've talked about because I'm taking a course on disability, like just very like a general course right now. And one of the things that we talk about is because there's so many laws and acts that affect disability, like the Aircraft Carrier Act. I'm blanking on its full name, but it's the act that pretty much says you have to have you can't not have a disabled person be allowed to fly. And that's one thing, which is, well, if you look at the bare minimum of that flight, with that law, it's like you can bring your wheelchair up to the boarding gate, then you get in, but then your wheelchair is one thing that might be broken while on the flight. So it's though these companies, these airline companies that are still following the law by letting you use your own wheelchair up until the gate and then leaving and then getting it back, there's not following protection, which isn't in the law, about making sure the wheelchair isn't broken. And it's still following the law, but it's not being convenient.
Sure. Oh my God. That's not convenient at all.
Yeah.
Airplanes, there's a required place for devices that need for them to be stored in. And, and those are, you'll find the flights that they really respect that, and find flights where they don't. And Rebecca provides that perspective of how tiring it is to always be your own personal advocate. And I think there's a stress and an exhaustion, and because I always teach my students that you have to be your personal advocate first. You have to, we live in a system that doesn't always see disability. And when I go to like concerts, for example, I sometimes those are the most inaccessible environments for someone with a disability, whether it's physical disability or even could be seizure oriented, can be sensory like needs. There's just so much more that concert spaces could do to support individuals who have various disabilities. And I think that Rebecca does a really good job of talking about the systems that hold people in place, and the systems that have held, basically held what has been going on currently in our society for the longest time, to ensure that there hasn't been a lot of movement and progression. I mean, from where we were in the 70s, sure, there's been progression and movement to ensure that there's more accessibility. But since passage of ADA and onward, it's been relatively the same, in my opinion. There's some organizations that do really well with providing disability sensitive spaces. Like I went to a theater in Rockville that with my students that had all these sensory spaces for my class, where I had a portion of my students who were autistic and needed a space that was outside of the venue, but also, you know, there was opportunities within the venue to ensure that they felt comfortable and had access to fidget toys and headphones and just like little stuff like that that can go a really long way. It's really great to see organizations that put a lot of passion into that.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And one of the nice things is having those things ready and prepared, like kind of like instead of like always having it prepared, you don't have to ask for it. Like I know one thing, the accessibility and disability services at our school at my university, they just, I don't know if they still do. Last time I was there, they just had these like buckets of like fidget toys in the waiting room, and you could just grab a fidget toy and like fidget with it while you're waiting, instead of maybe having to bring your own, and instead of having to like ask for one behind the counter. I don't know if they still have that out because of like COVID and things like that, but I do know that that's something that you did have, so you could just like borrow it. I'm sure some people took them. I didn't, but like kind of having that ready. Because it's just and it's kind of one thing which I did kind of want to touch on, which is there's something Lydia or Linda, I think she talks about, who asked to pray over Rebecca when she was at a coffee shop. And it's kind of that one thing, which is when you are disabled or you have a disability, it's very hard to not have to educate someone or not have to advocate. And like she just wanted to grade essays at the coffee shop, but now because this person asked if she could pray for her, how to choose, do I just feel uncomfortable and allow her, or do I educate her? And it's that thing, which is there's often where you feel you are forced into one of those questions of being uncomfortable or educating. And it's on one hand, it's not your job to educate people. And on the other hand, no one else will do it. So it's kind of having that things where like having things, someone like already educated, and that might be done through like having sensory tours, prepare someone learning, oh, these are things I should have ready. It's so nice to see that, where you don't have to advocate for yourself or you don't have to educate someone, because it's already like there and it's already happening.
Right, exactly. And that's the importance of having people in place who are disabled and who understand the supports that have made them successful, and to help organizations build supports that will be successful, you know, for them, for others. And I think that, you know, one of the things I've noticed in special education for sure is that, and it's hard because there's such a staffing shortage, so it's very, very hard for that every educator can fully understand the experience of their students. And I think for me, I am disabled and I have an understanding of what my students are going through. But I have many teachers who are friends of mine who are non-disabled, able-bodied, and, you know, don't always fully comprehend the experience that their students are going through or what their parents are going through. You know, it's very nuanced and very complex. I think, you know, I always urge, you know, when we're hiring or doing any of that sort, if someone comes in and discloses that they have a disability, that it's one of those things that they bring a perspective that you may not have fully really considered. Because for me, I know one lens of a disability scope from my own disability. The disability community is so large, and I think that, you know, what's really important is to see how organizations include more disabled people within their workforce to ensure that they're creating more accommodating spaces.
No, and I think that's one thing which is very true, which is it's this idea that I think some people might not know a lot about disability or think of it as being very separate, such as the student who at one point she teaches named Adam, who said that he had nothing to do with disability. And she points out, but you have a body, so do, like, no matter what situation you are, you do have an interaction with it, you just might not be aware of it. And I know that sometimes because of that mentality, there are people who might be hesitant to hire someone who is disabled, even though it's the law, because of their disability, because they might worry that, like, oh, it's going to be so hard to give them their accommodations, it might be so expensive, or I don't know if they might make people uncomfortable. And it's one thing which is just not knowing, like, a lot of accommodations that people need won't be that expensive, such as getting an automatic button, depending on the one you want, can be like at most $1,000, and if you are a big company, you probably have that. Or getting a screen reader, those aren't so expensive, but it's just not knowing because of this separation between disabled people and able-bodied people, and that uncomfortability, instead of allowing people to be comfortable by not hiring disabled people, it's like, well, you might be uncomfortable for a little while, but then you'll realize that disabled person is just a normal person and we can move on. Like, being uncomfortable isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it can be a good thing.
It'd be a very good thing. I think sometimes uncomfortability leads to new awareness. And I think if you have the ability to kind of tap into those uncomfortable feelings and be introspective in a certain sense, it can be really, I think life-changing in a certain sense, and more people could do that. But I do remember that situation you talked about with Adam, and I remember it so distinctly because as I was listening to it, it made me very frustrated, for sure, and I'm sure for Rebecca that was very frustrating to hear that a student just said, that's not part of my life. I don't know anyone disabled, and why should I care? And as I was listening to that story, it really reaffirmed to me why inclusion was so important to me when I was teaching at Ludlow Taylor, my previous school, because it built the awareness of my students to see that there were students who were their same chronological age, who had obstacles that they never could have imagined them facing themselves. And the empathy brought into their lives was just amazing to watch. I had kids coming to my room from different classrooms in the 5th grade, for example, checking on my kids every day, reading to them, making sure that they had their breakfast, and walking with them to specials. And I think it's one of those great learning opportunities in schools that inclusion provides a very powerful space for students to think outside of their realm, their sphere of life, and to include others who are different from them. And for my kids, it made their whole school year to have someone who was willing to come from outside of our classroom and to include them in all of the activities they were doing outside of in specials and such, and graduation. And so when Adam's story came on, I was like, I wonder just how much he ever truly understood how prevalent disability is in this country, in this world, in our lives. it's a part of the human experience. And I think, yeah, that was one that I'm glad she shared that, because
no. And I think it's one thing I like to say when talking about disability, because there is this idea that it's so separate, is if you were to say the equivalent about race or gender, would you get in trouble, or would it not make a lot of sense? So that's one thing I say if people are curious about if something they're asking is rude or insensitive. But that made me think of it with Adam. Like, if you were going to with this, like him saying, I have nothing to do with disability. Well, like that's not relevant to me at all. If he was to say the same about his race, it wouldn't really make sense and wouldn't have the strong argument, because of course he has something to do with race. He's just, assuming he's white, I don't know if he is, but if he is white, then it's like, of course you have something to do race. You just might be on the privileged side of it, so you don't think about it as much. And it's kind of the same thing with disability. Of course, he has something to do with disability. He's just between the disabled or not disabled. He is non-disabled, so it's not something that passes his radar a lot. And that's something that she also talks about later, which is what even does disability mean? Like, because she's like, what this perfect person is that's able-bodied, once you think about it, is very, very niche. So everyone, even whether or not they identify as disabled or not, is somehow connected will come in or out of disability at some point, such as like if you break your leg, well, temporarily you are debilitated, so you will think about ramps and you will think about elevators not being, and whether or not they're working. Or if you maybe have a midterm coming up that's really hard, so you have really, really bad anxiety for a couple weeks and you're canceling hanging out with friends, well, now you have the connection to someone with maybe generalized anxiety disorder or depression or something else, who that mental block and challenge that is stopping you from being able to do other things. And how like everyone is somehow connected to it, even if it's just you might know someone who has anxiety, and it's just once you start thinking about it, you'll notice how all these come up in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And she really Rebecca does a great job of deconstructing the term able-bodied and really going and really exploring what does that really mean. I think that there's a lot in my field, for sure, among special education teachers, the term able-bodied gets thrown around a lot. And most of the time it's referring to kids with physical disabilities. But those with have more cognitive or mental health disabilities or challenges, it's more, they don't speak to it as able-bodied or non-able-bodied. They speak more to it as just like a difference in their learning and such. And I'm always like, well, we have to explore that able bodies more than just talking through, physical disability. We're also talking through anxiety. We're talking through, depression. We're talking through cognitive disabilities like epilepsy, and some that might not be fully apparent to us. I love that she brought up that nuance, because the dictionary itself was very limiting. I guess the Oxford Dictionary, I love the reference she made to the definition of what able-bodied is, which referred mostly to a physical, I believe it was a physical incompatibility, something of that sort. And I just loved how she brought in that nuance and to include cognitive disabilities and mental health disorders as being a part of exploring able-bodied with those factors included in it as well.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And how what someone might consider disabling doesn't mean it's disabling for someone else. Like for me, I have depressive disorder, but I don't consider it a disability only if I'm having an episode, which I haven't had in a while. So I don't consider it one of my disabilities. But I have friends who also have like depressive disorder and do consider it a disability all the time, even if they're not having an episode. That's not I'm not right and they're not right. It's just different interpretations, and they might choose to disagree with me, or I might choose to disagree with them, and that's fine. But that doesn't mean I need to tell them that I don't agree with their disability, because that's a me thing. I personally don't. That doesn't mean that they're wrong. And it's that same thing with this person. I'm not saying I do. That's just an example. But like, it's that sort of thing, which is what one person's definition is might contradict with what someone else's definition is. But that doesn't mean that one definition is the correct definition to have. It's just different opinions on it.
Oh, for sure. And our experience with our disabilities is so personal. I think with anyone who has a disability, it's the experience to having that disability is unique to them. And I think, when we talk about spectrums and disability spectrums in particular, it's important to provide space for nuance. I think that's the beauty of understanding how it fits into our lives. Because I always talk about with my kids how, one obstacle we face may look different for someone else. And it's always important to be mindful and support each other through what we're going through, because it's, we're all going through something. And I think it's important to provide space for nuances to occur rather than having very rigid definitions for what able-bodied could be, what disability could be. So yeah, Rebecca's writing just provided that, opened up that, definition to be more inclusive, more, more broad, which is great. And also, I think it provided a lot of more, I want to say, reassurance of how much disability is part of our human condition in itself. So
yeah, no, I think that's very true. And I also think it's very true with the talking about the why it's so important not to have a singular voice for the disability community, even for a disability in itself. Like her thing, she makes really clear, she's like, I am just telling my story. And if it's, I'm probably going to have narratives that other disabled people will share, but I'm also going to have some that don't. And it's very true, even if it's the exact same disability, some people with autism are going to have very different experiences and opinions than someone else with autism. And it's kind of that whole, and neither one is wrong. And that's something I feel with my job as the disability representative for student government, like the disability representative. So every time I'm like running a meeting, I'm like, I'm just me. I'm speaking a lot from my opinion. I am also doing surveys and talking and doing a bunch of research to try and have as educated as I can be, but I ultimately do not take everything I have as fact, because I might say X and then you're going to exit this room and meet someone who says Y, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's no possible way that you can say something that everyone will agree with, even within the exact same community. And I do like that's one thing. And I think, especially because she addressed that, there are things that I definitely found that I did relate to her, and I definitely did find these things similar, but she's always very adamant that like this is just how she felt. And one of the ways she does that is just telling stories as kind of like evidence of why she feels that way. And I do really like that she does that, because like she is saying this is how she's come to this feeling and this is how she got this belief in it.
Yeah. And Herbert reminded me of a conversation I had with a colleague of mine a few years ago that tried to couple disability, cerebral palsy, with cognitive impairments, and tried to, make this assertion that they were synonymous with each other, they were coupled together. And, I looked at her and I was like, well, I'm going to give you some perspective here, because you're broadly saying that all of the students that have cerebral palsy also have a significant cognitive impairment. But I told her, I was like, I am an adult with cerebral palsy. And she looked at me and was like, really? And I was like, yep, I do. And we have to make some space here for those on the mild end of the spectrum, as well as making space for those that are across the spectrum. And I told her, I was like, my experience with cerebral palsy is this. And I don't have a significant cognitive impairment. I do have a learning disability as well. But, like when you're saying that children with cerebral palsy can't get a high school diploma, can't go to college, I just sat there and I was like, I've done all those things. And I know other people with cerebral palsy that also have done that too. So be very careful in overgeneralizing that, because for one child, that can be a very damaging overgeneralization. But if you provide space for that child to say, there is a chance you could get your high school diploma, there is a chance of that, of course. There's always a chance of that. We just never know. So, yeah.
I think that's very true. And coming off of the generalizations, I have ADHD and I have a lot of friends who have ADHD. And one thing I remember, I heard someone, I was talking to someone once and they were like, yeah, you know, like you're not going to find a lot of English majors with ADHD because a lot can't sit down or don't like reading as much. And I was like, I can't, like a lot of some of my friends with ADHD, a big chunk of them do like prefer watching TV because it can distract their mind, or maybe don't read super fast. But for me, like I know a lot of people with ADHD, some people I know that like they are like, yeah, when I read, my mind just wanders. So I watch TV instead. But for me, it's like when I watch TV, my mind wanders, so I read instead. Like it's not one experience in the same disability, kind of like you were mentioning, and these overgeneralizations end up making bad stereotypes, like the stereotypes that people with ADHD don't mind wanders when they're reading, meant that this person says that you're not going to find an English major with ADHD, which like is simply false. There are a lot of English majors with ADHD. Yeah, like it's very false, and also such a weird thing to assume. Like what is the purpose of that assumption? Because it doesn't make any sense. Like having that opinion it's just kind of this like weird fact that like is false and just doesn't add anything. It's just some weird belief that doesn't make any difference and can be harmful, because someone with ADHD might sit down and be like, okay, so I can't be an English major, or I can't want to read, or I can't work at a library, I can't want to write, like I just have to do something else. So like it can be like, even if you mean for something to be harmless, can become harmful.
Absolutely. And through my upbringing, I always found, some pleasure in myself to prove people wrong, and to have this mentality of, well, you say I'm incapable of this, but I'm going to try it anyway. And, there's going to be a way I'm going to access it. And my distinct example is learning how to learn a foreign language, having a language-based learning disability. I was always told I would never learn a foreign language. And I always told myself, well, I'm going to try. I'm going to give it my best. I know it's going to be challenging for me. And I know that I'm going to have obstacles that other students aren't going to face. But that doesn't mean I can't access a foreign language. And in fact, it became my major. So one of those things I'm like, because I was a double major in psychology and Spanish. And so I loved, being able to do something that for so long was told I couldn't do. I think there's just such reassurance in that. I think, Rebecca's stories can open up not just hearts, but build confidence in those with disabilities to share their stories of, what they've overcome and who they proved wrong and where they are today.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think like once I definitely know for me, like when people are like, you can't do something because of X, like I see that as a personal challenge. So like if you're if you're like, yeah, you're not gonna do that well at math, I'm like, well, I will take the hardest math class I can take and ace it. Like I have to prove you wrong, even if that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like it doesn't, that person, I'm not going to change that person's mind by proving them wrong, but I still have to do it. And for myself, kind of that thing. And it's almost like kind of like a way to make up for their insult by saying I can't do something, is I have to prove that I can do it to myself. And I feel like she mentions that a little bit in this book. I can't specifically remember where, but I feel like that's something she kind of talks about at some point, which is like people, it's with the like people assuming that she doesn't need help maybe getting in or out of her wheelchair or driving a car. So it's like, I'll do it faster now. I'll do it better than I was going to do it, to show you that I can get out of my car without falling down. And sometimes she does fall down, but it's kind of that like, I cannot fall down at this moment because I have to prove you wrong.
Right. Yeah. And it's that, I think, and I remember her talking about that, and there's no shame in falling down. I think it's one of those things I'm like, we learn so much from, as humans, when we fall, we learn so much from that. And I think for people with disabilities, it's like, like us, it's like, sometimes that fall, and especially when I talk about this with my students, can hurt so much more when you have a disability. Might be a bit more painful, but as soon as you get up and brush yourself off, it's always reassuring to try again. And I always tell my students, there's no shame in trying again. That's something that, one of my kids was told for the longest time that he wouldn't be able to walk, and became really motivated to use his walker because he had spastic cerebral palsy, and his legs had a lot of difficulty in terms of maintaining their strength while standing. And so he was able to walk down the whole hallway with his walker and back, and the school was cheering him on. And sure, like, there were a lot of days he cried, there were a lot of days that he fell down, but I always told him, I was like, as soon as you get back up and try again, it's going to feel better and better every time. And yeah, that's, I think for him, it was just really eye-opening for him to see what he could do, and also, I think for others to also see that he was capable so much when they labeled him so quickly. And yeah.
No, I think that's something too, especially because that's something he wanted to do, and it wasn't something he felt forced to do,
Right.
which I think is something that can definitely happen. And it's kind of like that. And it's also that one thing, which is, if to kind of go back to the fall thing real quick, like everyone does fall. And when you fall as a disabled person, it can feel a lot harder. So like if someone is like, maybe like really upset in class, and they're maybe like not autistic, just for the example I'm thinking of, then it's just, oh, they're having a really bad day. Where like if I start crying in class, I'm an autism stereotype, and it can be, you can like bully yourself much more in your head for doing something that an able-bodied person can do, and would, like, no one will think anything of it, or just be like, oh, they're having a bad day. And for you, the disabled person, can be like, oh, you're a stereotype. Even if someone isn't actually thinking that, you're thinking that. So that's one thing too. They're just like, they're constantly trying to, like, why falling is so important, and it can be so hard to do it, even though you should, because otherwise you feel like you're just kind of like given into the system that's like keeping you down.
Yes. And yeah, it's just the way she talks about systems too is so interesting as well, because I have, since reading the book, followed her Instagram, Sitting Pretty. I guess it's not Sitting Pretty. And, it's a really powerful platform that she uses to create, more visibility of her own life, but also to talk about the systems that are in place that are really detrimental to people with disabilities. I think I'm excited to see more of that awareness that social media can bring, because it's really it's super important for visibility. And, like, social media has its positives and its negatives, but I think for finding community, it's a really positive thing for people with disabilities to not feel so isolated. And that's how I felt growing up, where, you feel like you're the only person in your grade with a disability has its, you have your community of like 5 other people that you might know, maybe 10 that also have a disability. But I think, my middle school self and my high school self did not lend any awareness to nuance in disability conversations. I always thought it was like one thing. Had negative self-talk towards that. I can't do this and I can't do that because I'm this way and it will never change. And yeah.
Yeah, no, I concur. And I think one thing that's so nice about social media is you can just see disabled people living a normal life or living a life you feel like you can never get. Like that's one thing. Her Instagram is like her and her kid and like her and her husband just like being happy. And the other Instagram that immediately came to my mind, it's my favorite Instagram, is Jessica Calgren Fozard, and her Instagram is Jessica Out of the Closet. And it's just her with her wife and her son just living their lives. And it's very this kind of hopeful thing, because like so often when you see people with disabilities, it's very much in this kind of like, there's this kind of idea that they're just like sad and miserable, or that you can never have a family, or you can like never have friends besides those who might feel a little guilty and like are being friends with you out of pity. But like seeing these Instagrams of like Jessica and her wife and son, and Rebecca with her husband and son, just like being happy, living their lives, doing these things that even if you aren't explicitly told it, society sometimes does still tell you, or you feel inside yourself that you won't be able to do. So it's kind of so nice with social media, not saying that's like great and only good things have come out of it, but there definitely are good things that I don't feel like are talked about enough, in this way of having this hope that you can live a normal life, or feeling included and feeling like no longer isolated. Like in person, I know like one of my connective tissue disorders, I don't think anyone in person who has it. I know other people with hypermobility syndrome, but that doesn't always come with the pain that you do with a connective tissue disorder. But I know online, like like friends that I have online, or these like influencers or stuff like that, who do have these exact same disabilities as me. And I feel very like seen and there, and like this, that you are not the only person who is struggling with something, that there is a whole community, and finding that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what kind of disability visibility brought to light for me, that every person mentioned in that book had their own platform of some sort, whether it was on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, or even if it was more of a public persona that they had before social media. It was just really eye-opening to see just how much representation there was in one book. I was like, wow, this is amazing. And then there were a few people I've been following on Instagram, maybe in the past year or so, that, I think are working to dismantle some really awful stereotypes about cerebral palsy, about autism, about, being paralyzed. And there's this one girl named Chelsea Hill, I think is her name, who became paralyzed, I believe, from an accident that had happened in her life, either a car accident or something of that sort. And now she's doing like professional dancing and showing the world how she dances with a wheelchair, and does these amazing stunts that are just so cool. So I was like, and she's built this community around dancing and being in a wheelchair that has grown in awareness and popularity. And
yeah, that makes me think of this Instagram. I think they're called the Rolling Rockettes. I'm not sure, but it's an LA based LA-based group of wheelchair users who dance. And it's kind of one thing that is also mentioned in this book about Rebecca, she dances, and she dances in her wheelchair. And at one point there was a dance with wheelchair users in it, but it was much more just the wheelchair users sitting on stage with able-bodied people moving them around. But that's like, the dancing is so freeing for Rebecca to just do what she wants. And by having that able-bodied person move her around kind of took that away. And even if, you are dancing, you're in a wheelchair and you want someone to move you around, that's completely fine. But it's the only time that these wheelchair users were dancing on that stage is when they were being moved around. Every time else, they were just sitting.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's amazing to see what social media can bring to, I got so negative about social media maybe during the 2016 election.
Yeah.
Forgot, how beneficial it really can be for finding community, not feeling so alone. And, the number of people I've been able to connect with about my own disability, that's really fantastic. I never would have had that growing up. Facebook was always very private, so being able to expand out and see more people,
Yeah.
and really reassuring.
Yeah, and I've seen myself kind of like, I have a friend in Poland who recently I've never met this person in person, just like online, but like was recently diagnosed with the same disability I have. And they were like, this is like really awful. I'm really alone. And I like was texting them and I was like, don't like, it can be awful, but I also want to let you know that like, you aren't alone. Like, and I sent them influencers who like have these same disabilities, and like I was talking of kind of being like, this is what I do when I'm having like a really like rough day or something like that. And it's just kind of that one thing, which is being able to like to know you're not alone and help other people know you're not alone and just have those conversations. And that kind of made me think about a little bit, one thing that I really do like that has come out of the internet is is like helping each other. Like I'm kind of part of this very niche group on the internet of people with celiac disease / other inabilities to eat gluten. And like I find these accounts and it's just them like posting foods or posting restaurants, and I can be like, yes, not the lights turning off again. I can be like, yes, excellent. Like I now know that I can eat this cereal and I maybe don't have to read the back of the box. And it's just that like helping each other out and giving these tips that you can find online and stuff like that because of social media.
Yeah, I actually get this. There's someone I'm following that just got diagnosed with celiac disease, and they're a nutritionist. And so they're doing this whole series of nutrition and celiac disease now, and finding ways to build a more sustainable diet with the disease. And I was like, that's amazing to be able to build that out and use your disability as a source of strength for others. It's great. So.
Yeah, no, it's really good having that social media where you can just like and like because of this, like you can find out that like there are other things, that there are people who can help you and there are people you can help and learn from each other and stuff. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I have to say, I'm happy to be reminded of the positivity of social media, because I think I've been ranting. You can ask my child. I've been ranting about social media for a long time.
Yeah, so has always been something I've loved being in, but then, from 2014 to 2017, I was super negative about it. But I've gotten to see the more positive lights of it now, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to say that we're coming to the end, and I'm actually feeling a bit sad. Like because we're not only the end of our event for this evening, but of course the end of this particular series for at least for right now. And I do want to repeat to both of you, like truly what an absolute pleasure it has been, how much I've learned personally and professionally. As I said, I've been getting texts. I should read one that just came in. Let me just read this. I'm watching Finn and Chris, and I love them, all caps, multiple exclamation points. Please let them know I'm watching on YouTube. And I wrote back and said, I've learned so much from them. And this person said, yes, from me, so wise, exclamation point, exclamation point. And there's been comments in the chat that I've put on screen. But what you've done is it's really made a difference. It really has. And it's been fun and interesting and dynamic. So thank you both. I really thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It's really been a pleasure.
Well, you've been great. And we would, of course, anytime that you want to come back to the library or to the Office of Human Rights, we would be, delighted to have you. And we may, I'm sure, be reaching out to one or both of you again for one-off things. For people watching at home, thank you so much for joining in and being with us again. You've been with us now for 2.5 years as we do virtual programming with the library system. And yeah, you've been great. You show up, you ask great questions, you're involved and engaged, and you're the reason why we do things. And so thank you so much for tuning in with us. We do have a bunch of other great events coming up, and I invite you to visit our website, the Office of Human Rights. It's civilrights.mypgc.us, and there's an event tab, and you can go there. You can see what we've got coming up. You can also watch lots of our programs that we've had in the past, catch up on anything you might have missed, and you can see what the library has going on. And they have a lot. They have like 400 things a day. Don't quote me. I don't work for them. That's maybe not the exact number. pgcmls.info/events. Check out what they've got going on. And again, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. We're so grateful to you. And again, Findley and Chris, it's been wonderful. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you.